Hey everybody, thanks for joining today's call. I think it's going to be a big one because we have some big speakers joining. So I'm going to give it a minute or two more for people to get on the line before we get started. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to give it another minute or so to allow for some more people to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to today's National HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, affordable homes. I'm Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and I'm glad you're here. Today is an important call. We're going to discuss something that we've talked about briefly in recent calls this year, but today we'll go more in depth about both the threats and the opportunities that are ahead to defend and advance our HoUSed campaign agenda. So our collective advocacy is more important than ever right now. In Congress, House Republicans are threatening to default on our nation's debt as leverage to demand dramatic cuts to domestic investments, including, of course, affordable housing and homelessness resources. And this tactic was used by House Republicans back in 2011 effectively. It led at that time to 10 years of very low spending caps under the Budget Control Act. That was the so-called compromise to debt ceiling talks when President Obama was in office and House Republicans were threatening to default on the debt ceiling. And those 10 years of very low spending caps made it impossible to fund solutions to the housing and homelessness crisis that we face at the scale needed. And so our communities, our neighbors, we can't afford another decade of spending cuts to these critical housing investments, especially at a time when pandemic era protections have expired, resources are depleted, and renters are struggling more than ever. And I know that we can defeat this significant threat together because I have seen just how powerful and effective our collective advocacy can be. So this year will be challenging, but I have no doubt that advocates nationwide are up to the task. And at the same time that we're working to defend these critical programs, we can't lose sight of the need to advance towards housing justice. So we have to be successful in blocking efforts to dramatically cut federal housing investments, but we can't stop there. We also have to continue to build the political will for all of the HoUSed campaign's long-term solutions to ensure that everyone has an affordable, accessible, quality home in a community of their choice. So together we'll still work towards making progress and ensuring that rental assistance is universally available, in expanding and preserving the supply of homes that are affordable to the lowest income people, creating permanent resources to help renters in crisis, and strengthening and enforcing renter protections. So on today's call, you will hear a more detailed overview of the threats and of the opportunities and of the tools that we've created to help you all advocate with us. So before we do that, before you hear from NLIHC staff, we're really honored and have the pleasure of hearing from two of Congress's most dedicated, most effective champions for housing justice. So I want to check first and just see if Representative Waters is on. We're not expecting her for a couple more minutes, but I just want to check first and see if she's here. And if not, we will stick to the plan, and we will hear first from Senator Sherrod Brown. Unfortunately, he's not available to join us in person. He really wanted to be here in person, but he wasn't able to. And so instead, he sent some brief remarks to share with everybody who's joined today's call. And of course, you know Senator Sherrod Brown very well. He is the chairman of the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. And he is one of the most tenacious and effective champions for housing justice in Congress. So I'll turn it now to hear our recorded remarks from Senator Brown.
Hey everyone, I'm Sherrod Brown. It's good to be with one of the most important housing advocates in this country. Diane, thank you for the work that you do. Nobody stands up better and more importantly and more crucially than you. Everyone at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, the work you do to make communities stronger, to make housing more affordable. There is no other issue more important in our time. The committee, I took over as chair of the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee almost exactly 2 years ago. The committee was referred to around the Senate as the Banking Committee or Senate Banking. It was all about protecting Wall Street. Not about what it should have been, and that's changed in the last 2 years. Our first hearing in this cycle, in this year, is going to be about the state of housing. We don't protect Wall Street. We hold banks accountable. We fight for public transit, really important in housing, both urban and rural. And we will have a renewed focus on housing. Since I became chair of this committee, we've held multiple hearings about housing across the country, the legacy of racial discrimination in our housing system, all still having an impact, of course, the growing role of big investors in rental housing, the damage that brings to people's lives, to families, the bias in the appraisal process, senior housing, and much more. And over, we've heard the same thing as you do. Housing is too expensive. First-time home buyers struggle to compete with corporate landlords. Homes aren't available near jobs or public transit. Some communities haven't seen real investment in housing in decades. And even before the pandemic, a quarter of all renters spent half their incomes on housing. And you know what that does at the end of every month, the pressure that puts on a family. That's why I fought like hell for the child tax credit, which was in effect 1 year. Unfortunately, every Republican voted no and one Democrat changed his vote, but we don't give up on that either. Today, the black homeownership rate, unbelievably, is the same as it was in 54 years ago. We remember what we did before our time, before the time of almost all of you on this video, on this call, on this meeting, in 1968 in open housing. We still haven't made the progress we need. The solutions are out there. You've been fighting for them. Now Congress needs to do its job and make them a reality. Build more homes. Fix up the ones we already have. Make them accessible. Invest in the communities around those homes to provide equal access to opportunity no matter what zip code you live in. My wife and I live in Cleveland. Our zip code in Cleveland in 2007 had more foreclosures than any zip code in the United States of America. And what's left, the remnants, the residue of that is still far too important when you drive through our neighborhoods. We need to give communities the tools they need to end homelessness and prevent evictions from damaging more families. We need to give homeowners of color a fair shot to buy the home where they can raise a family and build wealth in that home to pass on to children and grandchildren. I want to keep working with you to invest in the communities that have been left or rejected, been left on their own far too long. We need your voices. We need your advocacy. We can make sure together that all Americans can find and afford a place to call home. Thank you for your engagement and your activism.
So we are so fortunate to have Senator Sherrod Brown as a champion for housing and homelessness in the Senate and as chair of the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. As you just heard him say, he is a really passionate and effective advocate for the solutions that are needed. And as he said there, we know what the solutions are. We need Congress to act. And of course, we all couldn't agree more and are really fortunate to have Senator Brown in the role that he's in to continue to advance these solutions. So I'm going to check now and see if our guest, Representative Waters, is on or available. Okay, it looks like she's likely on her way. And I want to continue to encourage everyone to introduce yourselves in the chat box. It's good to see who all is on and be able to greet each other. I see a lot of familiar names and some new ones as well. So it's always good to keep growing our work and our partnerships for our ability to be successful. So please keep introducing yourself if you haven't. And give us just a moment of patience while we see when our next speaker is able to join. Thanks. Look at all those introductions. That's terrific. Thank you for introducing yourselves, telling us where you're from, what you're working on. It's great to see you all here. Okay, well, while we're waiting, I'll just remind everybody briefly, because I don't want to go into too much depth. We'll be hearing much more from the NLIHC team later about some of the threats that are ahead. And one of the biggest ones, as you've all been reading about in the news and likely hearing about and maybe working on, is that House Republicans are really coalescing around a plan to threaten to default on the national debt and to use that threat as leverage to get dramatic spending cuts. They've already are saying that they don't want to cut what's called the mandatory side of the budget, and they don't want to cut defense spending, likely. And so that actually leaves very little of the federal budget left. And in order to get to the level of cuts that they want to see, it would mean very, very potentially very deep cuts to affordable housing, to homelessness programs, really to the entire social safety net. And there's a few ways that they are threatening to do so. They have threatened to cut some proposals that have already been made are as dramatic as cutting HUD's budget in half or eliminating the Section 8 voucher program altogether. And we don't expect those kind of really outrageous proposals to go through because we do have the House in control by the Democrats, and we have the White House who would veto any very harmful legislation. Although we're in completely new territory here, if we actually do default on our national debt, that's never happened before. But the bigger threat, as I see it, is what kind of compromise might come out of these threats and the negotiations to avoid the outcomes. And as I mentioned really briefly earlier, back in 2011, when President Obama was in office, there was similarly a contingent of House Republicans who were threatening to default on our national debt in order to ultimately squeeze out a compromise. And what the compromise was the Budget Control Act. And that has been 10 years, a full decade of these arbitrarily low spending caps on most federal programs, including housing and homelessness programs. And those low spending caps that were in place because of the Budget Control Act have been in part why we have not been able to make progress towards ending homelessness and housing poverty, because we haven't been able to fund solutions at the scale necessary. And you'll see later some charts that show over that decade and since just how deep the cuts have been to the programs that address homelessness and the needs of low-income renters. And so we've already been set back a decade. And it's only because in the last 2 years, the Budget Control Act caps were lifted. The Budget Control Act it ended. And so the arbitrary spending levels were able to increase. And that's why in the last 2 years, for the first time in a decade, and in some cases even longer, we were actually able to increase funding for key programs. Though the release of those caps on spending is why we were able for 2 years in a row to get new incremental vouchers for the Housing Choice Voucher Program, critical tool to end homelessness and housing poverty. That was only possible because the caps under the Budget Control Act ended. So we don't know what kind of compromise may come out of these negotiations and these threats. For now, the Democrats and the president has said there is a red line. They're not going to negotiate. But we're starting to see a little bit of weakening on that. And we have to guard very carefully against any of these deep cuts that could otherwise happen through these negotiations. So I think with that, actually, Sarah, I think I'm going to turn to you to get started on your overview. And then when Ranking Member Waters joins, of course, we'll turn to her and then come back to you.
Okay, sounds good. Feel free to interrupt me, Diane.
Hey, everyone.
Thanks, Sarah.
Okay, so the first thing I wanted to let folks know is that late in January, we issued a memo to all members of Congress. It's called Advancing Housing Justice in the 118th Congress. It outlines all of the ongoing need for federal investments in affordable housing and the long-term solutions that are needed in order to end the housing crisis once and for all. It's a really great primer for elected officials because it shares a quick snapshot of what all of the data tells us about the underlying causes of the housing crisis and what solutions are needed. And so we share in that memo takeaways from our annual gap report and our out of reach report and other key information that policymakers, especially if they're new to Congress, that they'll need in order to get oriented around the issue and know what direction to move in. We also use that memo to make the case for the National HoUSed campaign policy agenda. As Diane mentioned earlier on the call, we really focus on 4 main solutions, each of which would be paired with anti-racist reforms to break down barriers and ensure that people are universally available, housing assistance is universally available to everyone who needs it. So those 4 solutions include bridging the gap between incomes and housing costs through universal rental assistance or some new ideas like a renter's tax credit. We want to expand and preserve the supply of affordable housing that's affordable to people with the lowest incomes, largely through public housing dollars and housing trust fund dollars. We want to provide emergency rental assistance resources to help stabilize families in a crisis, building on the enormous success that we've seen coming out of the pandemic with the Treasury ERA program. And we want to strengthen and enforce renter protections because we know there's this power imbalance between landlords and renters that makes renters at higher risk of housing instability. Finally, the memo also identifies a lot of the content that we're going to go over in detail in today's call. It identifies the opportunities that there are to advance these solutions, whether in an appropriations bill for FY24 or through bipartisan legislation, or even really bold visionary legislation that might not be bipartisan. But we also highlight the threats to federal housing investments, including, as you'll hear a lot today, about threats that could come out of budget negotiations around the debt ceiling and our overspending. It's a really great resource, so I hope you guys feel free to share that with your members of Congress. Even though that they've received a copy from us, it doesn't hurt to have advocates and constituents also share this resource with them. So if you are looking for a place to start building your relationship with your member of Congress, this is a great chance. Take that memo and share it with them and endorse some of the ideas that are in there. And if you already have a relationship with your member of Congress, you can use this as another opportunity to continue that relationship going over time. So on today's call, Kim and I are going to go over those threats and opportunities, and then later on, Brooke is going to share with you some of the tools that we've created to help you advocate with your members of Congress. Next slide. As Diane mentioned at the top of the call, this advocacy is incredibly important. We always say that, but it's especially important this year, and that's because the threats are just so serious and real. We're seeing, as you all know, higher inflation and rent increases, and eviction rates are going up. In many cases, homelessness is going up. This is the time where we should be seeing Congress expand resources to fully address the housing needs of people who are struggling, not to cut them. And I know, as Diane knows, that when we work together, when we have the same message, when we're coordinating our efforts, when we're swimming in the same direction, we can be incredibly powerful and achieve really tremendous resources and protections for renters like we did during the pandemic. And we can do that now as well. Next slide. So we're going to start with a deeper dive on the budget cuts. And just to know that Waters' office, I think, is going to join us in 15 to 20 minutes. So that gives me a great opportunity to go through all of these budget threats and then have her join on. Okay, so as you know, we are in the midst of a housing crisis. This is not surprising. We know that millions of extremely low-income households are struggling to remain housed. Disproportionately, those households are people of color and people with disabilities. And they're one financial shock away from falling behind on the rent and facing eviction, and in worst cases, homelessness. So that means right now, on any given night, 500,000 people are experiencing homelessness and millions more are at risk. And the reason for that is because our federal investments in affordable housing just don't keep pace with what the need is. Only 1 in 4 people who are eligible for housing assistance get any sort of help, because Congress already dramatically underfunds these programs from the level that's needed. That's why we launched the House campaign in 2021, because we wanted to move ahead and build this movement, build the political will for the large-scale investments that we need. But if the budget threats that we face this year come into play, we could see those statistics made even worse. We could see people having to wait longer for housing assistance, to struggle for longer, and it would make it more difficult for us to achieve the goals of our House campaign. So as Diane mentioned, and as we've talked about on previous calls, House Republicans are pushing for really deep spending cuts in exchange for voting for lifting the debt ceiling or keeping the government open and avoiding a government shutdown. Right now, Treasury estimates that the US could default on its debt in June if Congress doesn't act, but we will get more information later this week when the Congressional Budget Office puts out its estimate for when the Treasury Department would reach that tipping point. So as Diane had mentioned, these negotiations over spending for this year are the single biggest legislative threat to affordable housing investments and the millions of people who need housing assistance this year. Part of that's because, unlike other legislation, Congress has to pass an appropriations bill every year or the government shuts down. And in order to be enacted, it means that at least 9 Senate Republicans will have to join on board, as well as the House of Representatives, which is controlled by Republicans. So all of that means that Republicans have an enormous amount of leverage to push for budget cuts and to force Democrats into negotiations. What worries me so much about this threat is that in order for Speaker McCarthy to win his speakership, he had to promise conservatives in his own party that they would cut spending at least to FY22 levels in this year's budget. So his seat and his ability to stay in power demands that he continue to push for these deep spending cuts. There are a lot of details that are unclear at the moment, but if we could go to the next slide, cutting the budget this way would mean that you'd have to cut about $130 billion from federal spending overall, or about 9% from last year. But the budget cuts could be a lot bigger, as you can see in this chart here. If the House Speaker had also promised not to cut defense spending, not to cut Medicare or Social Security, and that means the only thing that's really left over are those non-defense domestic programs, including housing and homelessness. And all of those cuts could be concentrated just among those priorities. If that's the case, if we see that entitlements are left off the table, defense spending, maybe veterans health spending is left out, what we could be seeing is a 1-year 24% cut to domestic programs, including housing programs. That's not even to mention the fact that other Republicans have called for even deeper cuts. Some want to go back to FY19 levels or want to put in place 10 years worth of spending cuts. And we know just how devastating those threats are. Next slide. So what we're seeing here is sort of a repeat of the dynamic that we saw in 2011. Again, the House was controlled by Republicans. The Senate and the White House at the time were controlled by Democrats, and House Republicans were threatening to default on the nation's debt in order to force out major spending cuts. And what happened was that Congress ultimately had to pass the Budget Control Act, which led to 10 years of very low spending caps that were put in place. And while over the course of that time, Congress was able to lift those spending caps to some degree, you can see here in this chart just how devastating those cuts actually were. So what I want to call out here is, if you can see in red, for the first 7 years, so between FY11 and FY17, HUD saw 7 years of real budget cuts after accounting for inflation. And during that time, HUD's overall funding was about $27 billion less than if HUD had just received level funding to FY10 with modest bumps up for inflation. And even though in more recent years, you can see we've transitioned to the blue spending that goes above where we were before, it's still less than if we had just funded HUD programs at FY10 levels plus inflation. I think Representative Waters is on the call. So I'm going to pause there and see if she's available. Or Diane, did you want to join on? There we go.
Yeah, I know she's almost available. I'm not sure she's quite ready yet. So you keep going and I will interrupt when it's time. Thank you.
Perfect. So the point I was making is that even though in recent years we've started to see increased funding for HUD programs, one, a lot of that took place after those budget caps ended, and two, even those increases in funding don't make up for the 10 years of spending cuts that we saw earlier. I want to go next slide, please, if we can. Oh, we'll go back one more. But even if Republicans are successful, let's say, in just getting 1 or 2 years of spending cuts, it really could have devastating impacts on the affordable housing and homelessness programs that we care about. So we'll take, for example, this year's spending budget for HUD programs. If we were to go back to FY22 levels, you would see at a minimum about an $8 billion cut to HUD programs, not including the need for inflation just to keep up with rental prices in our communities and to serve the same number of people who've been served this year. If we went back further and we're looking at 19 levels, that's about an $18 billion cut, again, not including inflation. And if the same thing happens where defense spending is exempted, entitlement spending is exempted, VA health programs are exempted, we're talking about really just tremendous cuts to housing programs that would be very hard for us to overcome. Even the new Transportation HUD Appropriations Subcommittee Chair, Tom Cole from Oklahoma, said there's no guarantee that people who are receiving housing assistance couldn't necessarily see that assistance taken away from them. That's how deep these cuts could be. So we have to take these threats very seriously. We have to engage members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, and we need to start that now. Even though we don't expect the government to default until June, we need to be using the next several months to make the case for why we need to keep these programs in place and what those cuts would mean to your community if they were to go forward. Next slide. We also want to make the proactive case here, not just push back against bad spending cuts, but also to make the case for what's really needed in our budget this year. So these are a list of our top priorities for the FY24 spending bill. We want to see rental assistance expanded, not slashed, so we can serve at least 200,000 more households and put us on a path towards universal rental assistance. We need full funding for public housing and homeless assistance grants. We're asking for $3 billion in emergency rental assistance to carry on the great work that many programs were able to achieve during the pandemic. $100 million in legal assistance to help people avoid evictions, and expanded funding for tribal nations that have the greatest needs. The other threat, if we can go to the next slide, is around proposals that Republicans are likely to offer and have already started to offer that would create new barriers to assistance and essentially take housing assistance away from households that need it. These barriers look like rigid work requirements, time limits, and rent increases for HUD-assisted households. We've already started to see prominent Republicans call for stricter work requirements. In particular, the House Ways and Means Chairman Jason Smith has said that without work requirements, families are trapped in a cycle of dependence for generations. The House Budget Committee Chairman Jody Arrington has said that they want to see stronger work requirements for TANF and the SNAP program, alluding to the fact that they would be carried over to other programs like affordable housing. And we've even seen legislation and an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal from Senator Rick Scott from Florida, who again called on Congress to create stronger, more rigid work requirements for the SNAP program and to apply them to public housing residents and households that receive a housing voucher. But we all know that work requirements, time limits, and rent increases aren't actually solutions to the housing crisis. And instead, they're really designed to kick people out of these programs and prevent them from accessing housing assistance in any way possible. These proposals are counterproductive, and they don't address the real barriers that we have to housing stability. It would leave more people without a stable home, which would in turn make it harder for them to reach financial stability and live with dignity. Why do we know this? Well, the reason why we know is because nearly all households that receive housing assistance who can work are already working. 9 in 10 are led by seniors, people with disabilities, or they're just working low-wage jobs that don't pay them enough to afford rent. Next slide, please. Our annual Out of Reach report shows that there's no state or community where somebody working full-time at minimum wage can afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. And those same workers can only afford a 1-bedroom modest apartment in just 9% of US counties. This is not an issue about people not working. It's an issue about people not getting paid enough. And the issue is systemic. If you could go to the next slide too. If you look at the 25 largest occupations in the US, 11 of them don't pay enough to afford a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. Instead, Congress should be focused on how do we lift up wages for workers? How do we increase income supports? How do we provide the housing that people need that allow them to go to work and make it easier for them? not to have proposals that cut people off from the very assistance that makes it easier for them to maintain a job. It's not clear if proposals like this are going to be able to pass in Congress because it would need the support of Senate Democrats to get through. And the White House obviously would have to sign onto it. The president would have to sign. But I still think it's really important that we take this threat very, very seriously. We need to explain to the public who may think that work requirements sound reasonable. We need to make sure that they know that these proposals aren't really about getting people to work and helping them increase their wages. It's about kicking people out of housing programs and would ultimately make it more difficult for them to work. We need to focus on moderate Republicans and Democrats and educate them about how these proposals would harm their communities. And we need to focus on how if we let these ideas continue to fester out there, they could turn into something much more difficult when Republicans are able to get the House, Senate, and the White House. With that, I'm going to pause and I will turn it over to Diane to introduce the Congresswoman.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. Really great presentation, and we'll come back to you in a bit. But right now, we're really thrilled and honored to have Representative Maxine Waters join our call today. You all know her very well. I think she is our most popular guest on our national calls, and she's joined us many times before on our calls and certainly in our fight for housing justice. She's an incredible, outspoken, effective advocate for affordable housing and for ending homelessness. And she is a powerful congressional leader, having served last Congress as the chair of the House Financial Services Committee. And in that position, she achieved historic resources and protections for renters and people experiencing homelessness. And she assured that the House passed Build Back Better Act included $150 billion in what would have been transformative investments in addressing homelessness and housing poverty in our country. And now, as the top Democrat on the committee, she will be instrumental to both defending key programs from harmful cuts and to continuing to lift up and advance solutions. So, Ranking Member Waters, it is, as always, an honor and a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
My goodness, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Diane Yento, for that warm welcome. It's an honor to be here with all of you today. As you all are fully aware, our nation is in the midst of an ever-growing affordable housing crisis that has forced more than 500,000 people, including children, seniors, into homelessness, and led to a nearly 40% hike in housing prices since May 2020, forcing more people to pay 30% or more on rent than ever before and locking millions of people out of their dreams of home ownership. Without a safe and affordable place to call home, families are forced to live in unthinkable and unsafe places. Our nation's affordable housing crisis must be met with urgency, both for the sake of families who are worried about whether they'll pay rent or put food on the table, as well as for the overall stability of our economy. Housing has been a key driver of inflation, driving us closer to a possible recession. We know that housing is at the heart of it all, from financial stability, better health outcomes, and educational attainment to determining the quality of our children's futures. As former chairwoman and now the top Democrat on the House Financial Services Committee, I've made it my top priority to address our nation's affordable housing crisis, end homelessness, and eliminate the racial wealth and home ownership gaps. During the height of the pandemic, committee Democrats sounded the alarm about a potential new wave of evictions and foreclosures, and we moved quickly to secure billions of dollars in critical housing relief through COVID response packages, including $46.6 billion for the Emergency Rental Assistance Program and $10 billion for the Homeowner Assistance Fund. This relief has allowed millions of families, including workers who have lost wages or experienced layoffs, remain safely housed in a stymied and early onset recession. Not only did my committee help families remain in their homes, we also secured $5 billion in the first of its kind emergency housing voucher program to rapidly house people who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness. These investments have helped house more than 140,000 people experiencing homelessness, reducing homelessness by 55% for veterans and 9% nationwide. When we prioritize people and invest in evidence-based solutions, we get results. So I am also very proud of the work my committee did to secure over $150 billion in the House-passed Build Back Better Act to create nearly 1.4 million affordable homes, lower the cost of housing, and make serious progress toward our goal to end homelessness. Much of this work was based on my groundbreaking legislative package, the Ending Homelessness Act of 2021, which would have transformed the housing voucher program to ensure every family who qualifies receives the assistance they need. While the Build Back Better Act did not pass the Senate, Democrats secured significant housing resources in the end-of-year omnibus funding package, which included $130 million in new housing vouchers to help affordably house an estimated 12,000 low-income families in the communities of their choice, $85 million to encourage the development of affordable housing in more communities, and $225 million to preserve the affordability of manufactured housing, communities, and to offset the displacement of the residents who live there. So despite significant strides in combating our affordable housing crisis, our work is not nearly done. As the political landscape shifts, with Republicans now holding the majority in the House, efforts by the Biden administration to increase the supply of housing, reduce homelessness, and increase renter protections through administrative actions will be critical in building on the progress we have made. I was pleased to see the administration's recent release of the blueprint for Renters' Bill of Rights. As we move to provide greater federal support to our nation's renters, we must build off of the major strides that congressional Democrats made to protect renters during the pandemic. So I want to thank NLIHC and its strong network in rising to the occasion last Congress when I called for all hands on deck to pass the American Rescue Plan Act and to secure historic levels of fair and affordable housing investments through Build Back Better. This Congress, I look forward to continuing our efforts by defending against harmful Republican proposals whenever necessary and working alongside my Republican colleagues whenever possible. I will never stop fighting for a reality in which none of our neighbors have to sleep on the streets. So I thank you for fighting alongside me, and I thank you for all that you do. And I want you to rest assured, I will never give up. I will never be intimidated. I will never go backwards, forward for all of our renters and our homeowners and the people of this country who desperately need the government's assistance. And I thank you for all of the work you do. Let's just keep going. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Representative Waters. It's always so wonderful and inspiring to hear from you. Thank you for those words of encouragement and inspiration. I hope you and your staff have a chance to take a look at the chat box and the Q&A box, where a lot of people are sending you a lot of love and thanks, and I echo it all. If you have time for a couple of questions, I don't know how your schedule has changed or if you're still able to stay on for a few more minutes.
I can take a couple.
Okay, so one of the things that we're talking about today are the threats in this new Congress and the fact that House Republicans are really aligning with this threat to default on our federal debt and the challenges that creates for continuing to fund all the programs that matter most to ending homelessness and housing poverty. And we're most concerned about some kind of a compromise potentially, for some deep cuts to housing programs in this process. So what can you tell us about how Democrats are approaching these threats? And what advice can you give us to help push back against any proposals to cut these key programs?
Well, thank you so very much for gearing right in on what we're in the middle of, and that is whether or not this Congress is going to raise the debt limits. We owe bills that need to be paid, and we must pay them. We be considered defaulting on our debt. And so the president is in negotiations with McCarthy and with McConnell. And so he's working hard, and he's let them know that he's not going to be held hostage, that indeed, that the Republicans must act responsibly and raise these debt limits. Now, McCarthy has tried to threaten us and talk about, in order to support raising the debt limits, that they have to have cuts in programs. They have not been able to identify where these cuts are going to come from, but we know that many of the Republicans want to make cuts in Medicare and with Social Security and with Medicaid. And so the president mentioned that in his State of the Union message. And of course, they tried to deny it. As a matter of fact, they tried not only to deny it, it was one of the times when they raised their voices during the time of the president's speech. However, it is true, they have tried, and they have members who are talking about it in different ways. They have some who are talking about raising the age limit. They have some who are talking about reducing the amount of money. They have some who are talking about revisiting it every year or every 5 years. They have so many different ways that they're talking about undermining Medicare and the other programs that they think somehow are benefiting low-income people or poor people. But what happens is they don't want the people to know what they're doing. And so they try to deny these cuts that are being talked about by Democrats that we know must be preserved. I want you to know that I sent a letter to the president of the United States of America. And in that letter, I said, housing must never be on the chopping block, that we will not stand for any cuts in housing. And so I didn't talk about anything else because I am focused on housing, and the rest of them were focused on Medicare and Medi-Cal. All of this is important, but I've made it clear that we will not have housing negotiated away in any shape, form, or fashion. So I want people to get on all of our platforms, and I want people to continue to say housing must not be undermined, it must not be cut. As a matter of fact, we should be putting more resources into housing to house the very and most vulnerable people in our society. We've got to do that. We've got to get on radio programs, on podcasts, on television shows, wherever we can have a voice. We must continue to insist that America owes it to the people of this country to support decent, safe, and secure housing for all of our families, all of our children.
Absolutely, and we are behind you all the way. We'll certainly be using all the tools and tactics that we have to back up your demand that housing programs be non-negotiable, no cuts to housing programs. Could not agree more. And we're so fortunate to have you as the leading champion to protect those programs. I'm wondering too, the other piece of what we're talking about today is these tremendous challenges, these fights that we have to fight, how we have to push back on these threats, but also that we want to look for opportunities to advance solutions. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on whether you foresee opportunities to work with Republicans to enact legislation that does have bipartisan support, and how you think we might be able to push some of those bills forward.
Well, I want you to know, in our very first hearing, I had an exchange with Mr. Scalise, and we had, of course, some amendments that we were pushing. He looked at the amendments and he talked about his disagreement with Housing First. And he went on to talk about the fact that Democrats push Housing First when in fact there needs to be work that's done with the homeless prior to them being able to be housed. And he talked about some programs that deal with drugs and would deal with all kind of other issues. And he said that we were not interested in that, and the way that we had drafted the amendments that we were trying to get in this first discussion, in the first hearing that we had. I literally tore up our amendments publicly, and I put them down, and I said, put it aside, because I want you to know, not only do I want to work with you, but I understand the housing crisis that's in rural America. And I don't feel that the rural tenants in these housing dilapidated shacks are getting the kind of leadership and attention that they need. I'm talking about what I consider a renaissance in urban and rural. And I want to work with you so that all of those people in the rural communities and these small towns who have not really been represented and not fought for, that we need to do that. And I am not going to be stopped with your arguments about Housing First. We're going to have to get together and resolve whatever differences we may have so that we can get housing for both the rural and the urban communities. And I made that a public argument. And so when you talk about, can you work with them? I'm really giving them the opportunity to try and see if they want to do something about areas that have not received the kind of attention that they need. And my implications were that many of you have not represented your own communities. I didn't say it quite that way, but I certainly meant it that way. And so I'm trying to, he said he wanted to work with me on it, that he accepted the challenge. And I'm trying that, and I'm going to move expeditiously to see what we can do.
Thank you for that. It's another one of the big challenges that we face is this new Republican opposition to what's clearly evidence-based best practice, which is the Housing First approach, and which, as you know, often had strong bipartisan support for many years until recently. So thank you for fighting on that front as well. And I know you must be just about out of time, but the last question I want to ask you is about your bill, which you mentioned in your remarks, the Ending Homelessness Act. And it is such a visionary and essential piece of legislation that, as you said, would provide the resources and the solutions that would be transformative to our efforts to end homelessness once and for all. So if you could talk a little bit about that bill and what path you see for moving it forward in this Congress and the next.
Well, thank you very much. As you know, I considered Build Back Better a real blueprint for what is possible and what we need to do. It was quite comprehensive in looking at our housing needs, everything from public housing to Section 8, to the National Housing Trust Fund, to you name it. We basically looked at all the areas of our housing needs, including support for first-time homeowners, et cetera, et cetera. That is the basic blueprint for what we need in order to address all of the concerns. You know, the New York Times did a great article on what's happening in public housing and what the needs are in New York, for example, where the elevators have broken down. I can recall it was just a year ago where I got a desperate call from Congresswoman Velasquez, who said there was no heat in a building. And so we're looking at those kinds of issues. We're looking at the fact that people have been waiting desperately for Section 8 voucher assistance for years, many of them. We're looking at the fact that there are landlords who are maybe not responding to the needs of those who have these vouchers. We're looking at the Housing Trust Fund and the fact that we must fund it adequately so that they can build affordable units for people who work every day and who have incomes that will not meet the cost of market-based housing, but deserve to have safe and secure housing. Affordable housing is tops on our agenda. So those are the basic kinds of needs for housing. And we will continue with that effort and maybe described in different ways, but we will not give up on the overall needs for housing in this country in every conceivable way.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Waters. It's such important legislation. We are with you. We are behind you all the way for that legislation, for other opportunities to advance those solutions that you laid out, and in the fight ahead to protect programs and ensure that they're not deeply cut. I know that you will continue to be just the extraordinarily effective leader that you've been for your entire career. So thank you so much for being such a strong champion.
Well,
And
thank you very
thanks
much.
so much for
Thank
joining.
you, thank you, thank you. There's no way we could get this done without your support and the support of people who are out there every day and know exactly what those needs are and have seen people suffering and asking their government for help. I know that you know that story. You tell it so very well. And thank you for your advocacy. It is that kind of work that will help us to get the job done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. All right, well, we are so fortunate to have such a tremendous leader like Congresswoman Waters on the Hill, as you can clearly see. And as you know from all the work she's done over the years and the many times she's joined this call before, there is no greater champion on the Hill for housing justice than Congresswoman Maxine Waters. So grateful for her leadership and for her time today and for the inspiration that she leaves us all with to move forward with. So I'm going to turn back now to Sarah Sadian to continue talking about the overview and what's ahead, and to hear from the others on the NLIHC team about some of the really concrete tools and tactics that you all can use to work with us, work with Congresswoman Waters and other champions to win against these threats. Sarah, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. And I do not mind at all being interrupted by Maxine Waters. The Congresswoman is always amazing to hear from and definitely inspiring in all of the work that we do. I'll just quickly summarize the last points I was trying to make around work requirements and time limits, rent increases on HUD programs, and how Republicans are very likely to propose those ideas this year. I mentioned that the thing that we need to do is really educate the public about the threats that these requirements would make. To a lot of people in the public, this sounds reasonable to put in place work requirements. And so it's really our job to make sure that they know that these really aren't about helping people get to work. They're counterproductive, and they're really about preventing people from getting the assistance that they need. The second thing that we need to do, I mentioned a little bit, is that we need to really target moderate Democrats and Republicans and educate them about these proposals. Republicans are going to be looking to make inroads with Senate moderates, many of whom are up for tough re-elections in 2024. These same folks need to be on our list of targets to talk with and educate over the course of this year. The last thing I mentioned is, even though I think it's less likely that we'll see these proposals enacted into law, we still need to see this as a long-term threat. Yes, it'll be hard for Republicans to cross the finish line with these proposals this year, but we don't want to see these sorts of measures gaining traction in the years to come. And so it's important that we're reacting and pushing back on these proposals when they arise. I mentioned so far that there's been a couple of different proposals that have been out there. So far, we haven't seen anything being offered by a member of the House Financial Services Committee or House leadership just yet. So when the time comes, when we see those proposals come forward, we will engage you. We will let you know that it's time to really take action and respond. I'm going to now turn to my colleague, Kim, who's going to talk. She has a happier job on today's call to talk about some of the opportunities there are to advance bipartisan legislation in this Congress. It's not all bad news. There are a lot of threats that we're very focused on, but that doesn't mean that we can't also be building the political support and building the momentum that we need for achieving really important policy goals. So I'm going to turn it over to Kim.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah, and hi, everyone. I'm Kim Johnson. I'm policy manager with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And like Sarah said, while Congress is going to be focused on, defending against the threats that Sarah outlined, we are also going to be continuing to pursue a long-term solution, the long-term vision and the long-term solutions that are needed to end the affordable housing crisis. Given the dynamics in Congress, bipartisan support is going to be needed in order to see anything enacted into law. And this Congress, we have the opportunity to advance 2 bipartisan bills that would help address homelessness and housing poverty: the Eviction Crisis Act and the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act. Those 2 bills are being championed by NLIHC's Opportunity Starts at Home campaign. And that campaign brings together allies from across sectors to advocate for federal investments in affordable housing and homelessness resources. These allies understand that that housing is fundamental to achieving other national goals like food security, healthcare access, and racial equity, to just name a few. Oh, great, perfect. The Eviction Crisis Act was introduced in the previous Congress by Senators Michael Bennet, a Democrat from Colorado, and Rob Portman, a Republican from Ohio, who has since retired, and introduced in the House under the name the Stable Families Act by Representative Richie Torres of New York. And the Eviction Crisis Act would create a permanent federal emergency rental assistance program to provide emergency assistance to households facing a sudden economic crisis that puts them at risk of housing instability, eviction, and of course, in worst cases, homelessness. The Eviction Crisis Act would build on the lessons learned from and the infrastructure developed during the pandemic to ensure that funds are distributed quickly and equitably. This year, we have Senator Todd Young of Indiana slated to serve as our Republican co-sponsor in the Senate, and we're going to be working to build additional bipartisan support for the bill in both the House and the Senate in order to see that bill enacted. Next slide, please. Thank you, May. And so the other bill I wanted to talk about is the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, which was introduced last Congress by Senators Todd Young of Indiana and Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. And that bill would fund 500,000 new housing choice vouchers with mobility services targeted to families with young children. If enacted, the bill has the potential to largely eliminate homelessness among families with young children in this country. And in addition to helping these families afford the cost of rent, the mobility counseling services would help them utilize their vouchers in neighborhoods of their choice. And that can include communities with high-performing schools, access to public transit, and other vital resources. As with the Eviction Crisis Act, we're going to be working to build additional bipartisan support for the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act in both the House and the Senate in order to see it enacted. Next slide, please. So my colleague Brooke is going to talk more about ways for advocates to get involved, but I wanted to flag our Take Action page as well. There you can find links to email your members of Congress and urge them to support these bipartisan bills. And the more members hear from their constituents about the need for these programs, the more likely they're going to sign on and support them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Brooke, and she is going to talk about our advocacy toolkits. Brooke, take it away.
Thanks, Kim and Sarah, for that really helpful overview of the threats and opportunities in the new Congress. Like Kim said, my name is Brooke Shipwright, and I'm the manager of field organizing here at NLIHC. Like Diane, Kim, and Sarah outlined for us, and even Representative Maxine Waters, it will be a really challenging year, but there are also real opportunities to advance our House campaign goals. Like Congresswoman alluded to as well, together we can and will advance housing justice and stop any threats along the way. And in case you feel like these threats are too big, let me just remind you that we don't have to look back very far to see just how powerful our collective advocacy can be. Together during the pandemic, we achieved unprecedented resources and protections to keep renters housed and to move people experiencing homelessness into safety. These were significant wins in their own right, but in those wins, we also grew our coalition of housing advocates, built political will, and will only be stronger in our advocacy moving forward. So with that, I'm going to lead us through through the different tools and opportunities that we have for you to join us in blocking these threats and advancing long-term solutions. So for our budget advocacy toolkit, that's the first tool I want to go over. It's a brand new advocacy toolkit to oppose the dramatic cuts that are being discussed to federal investments in affordable housing. This toolkit has everything you need to urge Congress to oppose these cuts and instead provide the highest level of funding possible. It provides a helpful overview of the threats to the budget that Sarah went over, including background on the Budget Control Act of 2011 that Diane mentioned, and why we can't let that happen again this year in exchange for lifting the debt ceiling. It also provides talking points to use when talking to your members of Congress and the media, including both defensive messaging on budget cuts like Congress should not balance our nation's budget on the backs of people with the lowest incomes, and offensive messaging to make the case for advancing our long-term solutions, such as federal housing investments reduce homelessness and housing instability, support thriving communities, and encourage economic recovery and growth. There are also sample social media messages with these talking points that you can use with hashtag cuts hurt and hashtag affordable housing, and a sample op-ed you can personalize and submit to your local media outlets. Both social and traditional media are great ways to get the attention of your members of Congress and the public, so I encourage you to utilize these resources in your communities. Next slide, please. Oh, yes. Finally, the toolkit also provides links to ways you can take action, such as our organizational sign-on letter, telling Congress to stop these cuts and instead fund affordable housing and homelessness solutions to the highest level possible, an email template and portal saying the same thing, and you can use that to directly contact your members of Congress. And it also has, I think it's the second to last page in the toolkit, other ways to take action, such as scheduling an in-district meeting with your members of Congress, hosting a film screening in your community and discussion afterwards, and inviting your members of Congress to tour affordable housing developments to see the impact that federal housing investments are having in the communities that they represent. Next slide, please. One powerful way we can all come together to share this messaging with our members of Congress and their staff is at NLHC's annual Housing Policy Forum and Capitol Hill Day in Washington, D.C., coming up on March 21st through 23rd. Our policy forum is a chance for you to hear from powerful speakers and thought leaders and connect with other housing advocates from across the country. Our annual Capitol Hill Day will be the last day of the forum on March 23rd, and it's our biggest advocacy event of the year. I'll soon drop a link in the chat to register for the forum and Capitol Hill Day, as well as a link to register for our Hill Day prep webinar on February 28th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, where we will provide you with the latest intel and talking points, and Housing Narrative Lab will walk us through best practices for getting these messages across to Congress, congressional offices, and incorporating our own stories and experiences in that messaging, because that can be a really powerful way to drive the message home. If you'd like to learn more about Forum and Hill Day, you can contact your organizer to learn more, and I'll also drop the link in the chat for that to find who is the organizer for your state if you don't already know. Next slide, please. So because advocacy is an ongoing effort and not just one day a year, we will continue building our momentum before and after Hill Day with ongoing actions you can take to push forward housing solutions. Like Kim mentioned or alluded to, our Legislative Action Center has different links to actions you can take. It's our main resource for you to access our policy priorities and key actions to take to both stop threats and advance long-term solutions. If you scan this QR code or follow the link below it, you'll find easy to use tools like the ones that Kim mentioned to contact your members of Congress directly, look up your members if you don't know who they are, and add your organization to our sign-on letters. This includes, like I said, the ones the email mentioned, our budget email and sign-on letter, and additional opportunities to advance housing solutions. Next slide, please. Finally, advocacy is the most powerful and fun when we do it together. So I invite you to keep joining these calls every other week. These house calls will remain our main vehicle to share the latest intel from Capitol Hill and next steps needed from advocates. If you're someone who's been directly impacted by affordable housing issues, your voice is especially critical in this movement, and we invite you to share your story with your members of Congress, with us at NLHC as well, such as writing a post for our blog, connecting with other residents on our monthly Tenant Talk Live webinar, and reading or contributing to our biannual publication called Tenant Talk. We actually just released our latest edition of Tenant Talk last week on tenant protections, and I encourage you all to check it out, and I'll share a link to that shortly. And along those lines, I'll just note that NLHC believes it's important to center people who are or have been directly impacted by housing instability, and we compensate people with lived experience for sharing their time and expertise with us through writing and speaking opportunities like the one I just mentioned, and we encourage others in our network to do the same. So you can contact your organizer as well with any questions about that. Second to last, I'll just mention you can support NLHC's efforts and be officially counted in our network by becoming an individual or organizational member at any amount that works for you. And last but not least, you can and definitely should connect with your organizer from your state. Our organizers are very awesome and serve as a central point of contact for you. They're really a great resource for answering any questions you might have, learning about ways you can get involved, or navigating any of the resources mentioned on today's call. And with that, I'll ask that we just go back really quick to the previous slide so people can pull up their phones or computers to get ready to take action while we take any questions folks have. And I will turn it back to Sarah to facilitate that discussion.
Thank you, Brooke. I appreciate that so much. I did see some questions in the chat box about if you could just reiterate when Capitol Hill Day is, how people can register, and whether there are virtual options for participating.
Great questions. Yes, so Capitol Hill Day is the last day of our policy forum. Our policy forum is March 21st through 23rd with Capitol Hill Day on March 23rd. I will, in just a second, drop a link to register for those. And yes, we do have virtual participation for Capitol Hill Day. We're going to do it hybrid for the first time this year so that folks from across the country can join. So if you have questions about that, you can contact your organizer.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brooke. I don't see other questions about today's agenda. But just as a quick reminder, we want to thank you so much for participating. These threats and opportunities are really important for all of us to be working on and paying attention. And so going forward on our national house calls, we will keep you in the loop about where we are, where Congress is, and what actions are needed to be taken. But this should give you a really good primer about what the year ahead will look like in ways that you can take part. And with that, we will close today's call and we will see everybody in a couple weeks. Thanks, everybody.